I'm David Kubiak, and I approve this message.
What affiliation do you have? What's your affiliation, your organizational affiliation? What's brought you to Toronto?
Well, the immediate affiliation is I'm currently executive director of a group called 911truth.org that is trying to coalesce all the energies of the different researchers, the people who have been working on this for so many years, and trying to put a political edge on it so that it actually has some effect in the process, so we don't keep doing this as a sort of a combative teams of researchers with different theories and try to go after what actually happened in the most generic sense and bring it to political realization in the public mind so that you can understand modern history and reclaim it.
Give us a little bit of your first impressions. Where were you, your first impressions?
Okay, I was at home at the time in Kennebunkport, Maine, and I was working with a group that was organizing a Chautauqua, which was supposed to be a 3-day strategy session for grassroots groups across the state, trying to confront the reality and the power of corporate rule, both as it affected us domestically and as it affected the world. And the date for the event was on the September 21st. It ran from the 21st to the 23rd. So when that thing came on the television in that morning, trying to understand everything that we've been studying and actually doing prep for this conference was how we had been overreaching ourselves overseas, the pillaging of the third world assets, the oil obsession. All of that just sort of came up in this huge fiery exclamation point. And at that point, I didn't have any suspicion. I mean, I was just basically in shock for a couple of days, trying to figure out how this was going to affect, the universe and what was really happening. And at the level of the news was coming out, there weren't really any facts at all, and the facts that were coming out were contradictory, patched together. They didn't know anything, then they knew everything, and suddenly there are all these question marks that start to arise in your mind. I mean, number one, how could this happen? How could airplanes be in the air that far, that long in America? How could the most secure airspace in the world be left totally undefended for over an hour? How? And so your heart's racing, you're half in grieving with the families and understanding the human tragedy involved, and on the other side, the other side, you're just totally filled with questions. There's absolutely nothing there that you can hang anything resembling sanity on, and suddenly the patriotism and the flags start to go up, inquiry is shut off, and you feel stranded. So when we had the meeting a week later, first I thought nobody would show up. I thought everybody would be so freaked because it was essentially, in those terms, an anti-patriotic thing to ask any questions, and that's what the whole Chautauqua was about who was running the country, who was profiting from things, and to what degree, if any, we could trust what the government was doing. And now you had a sudden crisis with the only voice you hear is the government, and to the people of Maine's credit, they packed the hall. And they addressed this stuff. It was with Jim Hightower and Ron Duggar and Granny D and a lot of other, people who had been populist legends in their time, and they were up there already, 10 days later, willing to ask the questions and already being afraid, that number one, there weren't going to be any answers, and number two, all of us were in some kind of peril, and it wasn't just us in the room, it was us in the world.
Did you have a conversation about what had happened on 9/11 at that event?
Yeah, it was huge, and people who had been so pent up about it suddenly were able, there was a comfortable environment for the first time that they could actually tell what they feared in their hearts and what they felt. And this fear that had come down on people was let loose that one day, and people just grieved in public, and it was healing. But it also, people were starting to talk about their fears about, was the government involved? Because already you could begin to see the outlines of the reaction, both in terms of the Afghanistan attacks and also in terms of what was going to happen in America. Because George Bush's first speech was broadcast, while we were up there for the event. And the standing, rolling ovations, and the total Pavlovian response. And everybody could see that this was going to go places that nobody ever wanted to experience. and nobody wanted to live through, really. And how...
So there was a sense of like Big Brother just looming, growing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like the whole top half of the American brain had just been turned off, and everything was operating on this sort of visceral lizard brain level. You know, we have been struck, we must strike back, we must strike back, we will get them, we will. And it was all talk of revenge, and it was all talk of, you know, the most primitive of responses.
You mentioned a moment ago how they knew nothing 1 minute, and the next minute they knew so much about the perpetrators. Was that a red flag for you, and why? Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, at first, the first day, it was just a total blank about what had happened and where it came from. And then within 48 hours, the FBI was putting out an entire list of hijackers and who they were and where they came from, and photos, and all of this kind of information that just seemed inconceivable, you know, because you couldn't understand where was the data coming from. You saw these fiery explosions, you saw the collapse of the towers, you saw there was no place that they could pull out DNA, let alone out all of these kinds of facts. So you're wondering where in the world is all of this coming from? If there was not tracking going on, if there was not some foreshadowing of this thing, and if that was the case, then the air response made absolutely no sense at all. So those were the early kind of visceral things, saying, you know, this is not only a terrible tragedy, there's something much deeper, darker, and more deadly going on.
Yeah, George Tenet, though, on the other hand, actually that very morning, within minutes of the first strike, said this is the hallmarks of Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, to have a sense of that, given his warnings, but to have the entire cast and crew all lined up for you on the program is an entirely different issue.
What were your thoughts about, like, what could we do? What did you start making a plan or thinking about some kind of response?
Yeah, well, the point of the Chautauqua, and again, this was only emphasized, and this is why people showed up, I think, is because the premise was that we had suffered a corporate coup d'etat in America.
What does that mean, corporate coup d'etat?
That essentially the corporations or their agents were now in control of all of the operative branches of our government. They were in control of the legislative process through the campaign finance legislation, or the absence of such. They were in control of our regulatory agencies. They were in control, essentially, of the executive branch with the advent of the Bush-Cheney, you know, and the whole neocon cabal. And they were in control of the media. So, I mean, all of the vital things that were necessary for the conduct of a democracy, whether it be the information or the legislation or the executive will to represent the people, was all now in the hands of the corporate interests. And that's what the Chautauqua was about. And how do you confront that? I mean, you have a corporate coup d'etat that was, you know, evident since Reagan. It was blatant since Florida. And now it was triumphant after 9/11. So, you know, at this point, what is the people's recourse? And the only thing that was left to go after was the truth of this event and how that could be brought to the American people. And at that time, we had nothing to work with. You know, I mean, as I said, it was 10 days after. But we did have the history. You know, we did understand the forces that were going to come into play, because we had seen them foreshadowed in earlier events. And we understood basically that when a corporate mentality or corporate consciousness runs your governance, then everything is cut off except for elements, I mean, the equation of power and economics. And all the other human values, everything has to do with human welfare, having to do with spirituality, having to do with, you know, familial issues or the environment, those are all externalized, as they are in classical economics. So from this point on, if this kind of traumatic event is going to give this government a totally free hand, what can we expect? And most of everything that was prophesied that day, you know, in terms of the corporations entirely controlling the legislative and executive agenda of the country, has come true. And the second question was, how can we fight back? And that was a lot less clear. We had no idea how long the flag storm was going to last, and how long we were going to be allowed to speak out. You know, there was a lot of fairly rational paranoia running around in those days.